Welcome to Novelist Spotlight, the podcast where published fiction writers are interviewed to gather their insights and writing lessons so we can use them to make ourselves better and more effective writers. Now, on with our program.
First of all, I want to really thank you, Mike, for having me on your podcast. It's really great to be here. My name is Sue William Silverman. I'm a memoirist mainly. I've written 4 books of creative nonfiction, 2 memoirs, and 2 essay collections. I've also written some poetry. But I think that the main thing you might want to know about me is that I write about some very dark subjects, but I also write with some irony. And probably you'll be able to tell that from the titles. The first memoir that I wrote was Because I Remember Terror, Father, I Remember You. And that book is about growing up in my incestuous family. So that's obviously, rather a dark book. And my second memoir, which sort of evolved from the first one, is Lovesick, One Woman's Journey Through Sexual Addiction. So obviously the sexual addiction evolved because my father had sexually molested me. And I needed to have a whole book to really explore that and, how it affected me. From there, I went into essay collections, and one of those is the Pat Boone Fan Club, My Life as a White Anglo-Saxon Jew, which hopefully from the title, you can see that's a little bit more ironic. But mainly, it also sort of evolved from the first 2 books in that growing up, since my Jewish father sexually molested me, I really wanted Pat Boone to be my father. And for those of you who do not know who Pat Boone is, he is a 1960s pop music icon. So, he was like sort of the American Idol of his day. And he's very Christian, and he's sort of known for being sort of a conservative Christian, which in fact I am not at all. But, back then growing up, what did I know? So I just really wanted him to be my father. So, but the book itself is not all about Pat Boone by any means, but it is about a kind of quest for spirituality. And that quest, on that quest, I undertake, a lot of different sort of topics and ways that I sort of look for somebody to sort of spiritually save me. And then my most recent book is How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences, which you might also can tell is sort of ironic. And even though I firmly want to believe that I can survive death, it's really more about my fear of death, what the origin of it is, the fact that I've spent much of my life sort of being a hypochondriac. So even if I'm not sick, I think that I am. But it also explores more what I might call sort of mini deaths, sort of those inconveniences, things like divorce, addiction, just
There's a
any
lot of ways
kind of
to
loss.
die. A lot of ways to die, right, Sue?
Exactly. Just sort of spiritual and emotional deaths, things like that. So, and in addition to writing those books, I've also written a craft book called Fearless Confessions, A Writer's Guide to Memoir. And I teach writing at Vermont College of Fine Arts, which is a low residency MFA program. So I probably should pause there because that's probably all enough to know about me right now.
Well, hopefully our listeners have gathered one woman with 4 memoirs. Now, most people think, what is it about my life that is notable that would really call for a memoir? And yet, Sue, you have written 4 of them. You're known as a memoirist. You teach the craft. And each one of these has susses out a different part of your life.
Yeah, exactly.
Correct? So talk a little bit, to begin with, let me just clarify something, because I want to see if what I've been told in the past squares with you, since you're an expert in this area. What is the difference between a memoir and an autobiography?
Yeah, that really is a great question, because an autobiography is sort of what celebrities write. People like me, ordinary people like me, write memoirs. And an autobiography really is one volume about your whole life, but it sort of stays on the surface of experience. It's sort of like this happened to me, and then this next thing happened to me. So there's not a lot of reflection or sort of that search for inner truth. In many ways, since it is celebrities who write these memoirs or famous people, for the most part, they try to show themselves in a good light. Whereas in memoir, it's not necessarily that you want to show yourself in a bad light, but you really do want to show yourself in a very honest light. It's a search for truth. It's self-exploration. And autobiographies don't have a lot of self-exploration.
Yeah, that's pretty much consistent with what a memoir being a portion of a life or a drama within somebody's life, where an autobiography is the full life of a person.
Exactly.
And, you know, I want to tell you that a turning point for me with memoirs was when I read Growing Up by Russell Baker, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. And now Russell Baker, who's no longer with us, but he was a columnist, a terrific columnist for the New York Times. And he wrote Growing Up, wins the Pulitzer. He went on to write a second memoir called The Good Times, which was excellent as well. And that got into some of his time at the New York Times. But Growing Up was such an ordinary story in a lot of ways. There was nothing that was standout or remarkable that you would say to this man, you need to write a memoir or you need to write some kind of autobiography. But he told it in such a honest and charming way. And have you read that one, Sue?
Yes, I have. It's a long time ago, but it is absolutely brilliant. But I'm glad you brought that up because in many ways, that's really important for writers to know that you don't have to have had something dramatic or sort of headline worthy happen to you to write a memoir. Whatever your story is, if you feel important about it, then it's meaningful to you and you will convey that meaningfulness on the page. And honestly, you can write a memoir about whatever your life is, because it's still your life. And if you don't write that story, nobody else will. And it can be a seemingly quiet life, because all lives have a deep interiority to them. And so when you're trying to seek that out and explore sort of the self in a very deep way, whatever the outer story is really less important than what that inner story is. I mean, because that's what memoir is in many ways. It's that inner story.
Right. And, here you are writing nonfiction. A memoir is nonfiction. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, though, Sue, on a fiction writing podcast is because what we see a lot of today and what's really successful is autofiction, where clearly somebody is telling their story. It is autobiographical, and yet it gives them the latitude to go ahead and write, to do a fusion of fiction and nonfiction, of autobiography or memoir plus fiction. And you get this very strong and consistent voice from beginning to end, which really appeals to readers. They want somebody who's in charge of that story and talking about something they can relate to. Now, that's not, of course, always the case, but I'll give you an example that I recently had was Homeland Elegies. And it says a novel by Ayad Akhtar. I'm probably butchering his name. He's Arab or Persian. I'm not sure if he's Persian or Arab, but it was clearly, he says a novel. It was clearly autobiographical. And I couldn't relate to the story in terms of any kind of events in my life. And yet the story was terrific. It spoke to me. I devoured the book.
Exactly.
And,
because
it was very good.
Yeah. I mean, because at the heart of it, it's really, as I say, the outer story. I mean, it's important, but it's not the most important thing, because really what we're writing about is the human condition, the human experience. So we're writing about emotions that we all share. I mean, in some ways you could say that my book about sex addiction is really about loss, alienation, search for identity. those are things that most anybody can relate to, whether you look at it through the lens of a sex addiction or whatever, anything else. So that's what we're doing. We're writing the human condition, and then people can relate to it. Another sort of autofiction book that I love, one of my favorite, is The Lover by Marguerite Duras, which is sold as a novel, but it's so autobiographical. And it's absolutely gorgeous. It's beautiful. And again, on the surface, I can't really relate to her story, but it is so deep and beautiful. And she's a stunning writer. So, and yeah, I myself have not written auto fiction, and I'm not sure that I can, but I really admire people who can do it. And it does give you a little bit more latitude to kind of play with the facts or something, and to sort of maybe better frame the narrative in such a way.
And some people might see it as cheating or whatever, but what people want is story. They want story.
That's right.
One of the things that I don't think a lot of people appreciate, Sue, is that there are a lot of people out there who read, but they have difficulty reading. They don't track particularly well. Reading is an exacting sort of activity. And I think this is one of the reasons why audiobooks have done very well, because it's having it read to you can be a very helpful thing. But when you're talking about getting back to this whole idea of a strong authorial voice from beginning to end, it's very easy to track a memoir or autofiction, because you've got one person who's telling the story. They're always at the center of that story.
Right.
And it makes it easy. And it makes it easy to track. It makes it easy to stay with that person. It is when there's a lot of characters bouncing around and a lot of crosstalk and such that I think a lot of people do get lost. But I did want to ask you about your very first memoir. You had the experience of thinking, well, who's going to be interested in this? This is my own story. This is me. And you were shocked to find that not only were people interested, but you received some real accolades for that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all. And yes, it was shocking. I mean, it took me forever to even think that I should or could write about myself. And then I did. And then I thought, well, who's going to care about, my little story and everything? And I really had no expectations that it would even get published. And then I sent it off. So there's this organization called the Association of Writers and Writing Programs. And every year they have a competition in creative nonfiction and fiction and poetry. And so I just sent it off almost on a lark. I was sure it would not win. And then it did win. And I was absolutely flabbergasted, but also just so moved. And, that's what sort of started off my writing career, is that I decided to, submit this manuscript to this award series. And I did get a lot of very positive feedback and support for that book. And, I just thought, I don't know, people would think I was awful or something. I mean, I just couldn't think of how, I couldn't really see the reality of the fact that, okay, I had done nothing wrong. My father had molested me. And I think I really just needed to write it out to sort of see the truth, and then have all of these people sort of, yes, Sue, this really was a terrible thing that happened, but you turned it into art, and that's a wonderful thing. And just to have that support was very empowering. And then to have so many women contact me who really thanked me for telling their story too. So as writers, we're really lucky that we have a voice, that we can put our story out there, because a lot of people don't have a voice and they're just sort of lost. But then when they read our books, and then they can relate to them, and then we can, have this encounter with each other. It's empowering for them, but it's empowering for me to have those interactions, between sort of author and reader.
Was it cathartic for you? I mean, did you feel like you worked out a lot of the trauma or the bad memories of it, or maybe some of the stumbling blocks in your life when you wrote? And again, the title, which Sue mentioned earlier, because I remember terror, Father, I remember you. What about that?
Well, I don't actually use the word cathartic just because I think I really worked out sort of the deep trauma in therapy. But when it comes to writing, it's really turning that story into art. So I become more of an artist than that wounded person, which isn't to say that writing didn't help me see things more clearly. It did. And I was able to discover my metaphors around the experience. And I was able to enter the experience in a very deep and emotionally authentic way. But I would say that more of healing for me happened in therapy, and that writing is a different. So it's not like one is better or, more effective or not. If you can do both, great. But the writing for me was just a different way to explore that experience. And yes, come to terms with it, because after I wrote it, it was to a large extent taking my father, who had sort of haunted me, and now he was sort of haunting me internally. And now I was able to put him on a page outside of myself. So like he lives between the covers of a book. And so it does, it is empowering in that way, that to diminish his power or his hold over me gives me more power. So I guess there's a little bit of catharsis going on there. But as I say, in many ways, I become more of an artistic me than that wounded child me. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And it sounds like you worked this out so you went to therapy, you worked a lot of this out in therapy. Would you have written the book if you had not gone to therapy? Was that a linchpin in actually getting this project done?
Well, I started writing way before therapy. I started as a fiction writer. And I can't tell you how many really terrible novels I have that are thankfully unpublished, sitting in a drawer someplace collecting dust. So I started out, but yet all of these novels, talking about autofiction, all of these novels are autobiographical. And so I was trying to work it out as fiction. And because I just thought, I would be a fiction writer, I would be a novelist. And then I got into therapy. And the thing of it is that it was really my therapist who suggested I write about myself. It was not a writing professor at all. So that's sort of a long answer to your question, but I think I would not have written this memoir, at least then, if it weren't for my therapist fully believing that I should write this a memoir. So in some ways, I started out sort of trying to please him. And then I thought, oh, I think I'm really onto something. And I think I really have found my authentic artistic voice. And then sort of the rest is history.
So you mentioned being an artist. So it almost sounds like you need to kind of step back from the experience itself and give yourself enough distance from it that you can work with it in a way that you turn it into art rather than just a download of emotion.
Absolutely. I mean, like a journal is not a memoir, or what I like spew out in all those therapy sessions would not have been a good, this screaming and yelling and crying and sobbing, all that ugly stuff. Well, not ugly, but that's like hyperventilated emotion. You need to sort of, which isn't to say that I haven't written about things that were very sort of ongoing and painful at the time, because I have. So it's not so much that you necessarily need the distance of time, but you do need some emotional distance, I think, in order to take this true narrative and turn it into art. Because being a memoirist is very much as much an artist as being a poet or a fiction writer. It is a craft. It is an art. And you have to learn that craft, and you have to study it and learn how to write so that you can write with some bit of irony or metaphorically, to discover the metaphors of the experience, for sure.
One of the what you bring to mind for me when you say that is Patti Smith wrote Just Kids, her
Yes.
story with Robert Mapplethorpe, and I went through that whole autobiography or memoir, and I remember saying to my wife, she does it with such detachment, not detachment in a cold way.
Yeah.
She's non-judgmental. It's just these things happen. This is a life. This is real life. It's how things happen. She never took a harsh word to anybody. She treated it as almost from a spiritual basis, that I came here to do certain things, to live a life. These things happen. This is what happened. And she did it in such a way that she could have easily taken strips out of people, and she didn't do that at all.
Which is brilliant, and a brilliant decision, because writing a memoir is absolutely not about revenge at all. I mean, it's real. Like, I didn't write my first memoir to sort of get back at my father in any way. I wrote it to understand the experience, to explore how it affected me, to explore what my life was growing up, because growing up, I had no clue that even what he was doing was wrong. I mean, I was just so lost and confused. And so it is a quest, that you enter into of self-exploration. And that is, for me, what a really good memoir is. So it's not about like getting back at anybody at all.
No. Now, how did you move from writing fiction, ill-fated fiction, and ended up in the drawer like so many of us, to making the decision that you wanted to write a memoir?
Well, as I say, it really was my therapist. I mean, he was, he knew, of course, that I was writing fiction, and he knew about all my failed novels. And it was really one day he said, Sue, why don't you write about yourself? And I said, well, I have nothing to say about myself. So he looked at me like the way therapists look at you and say, well, Sue, I'm not sure that that's true. I think you might have something to say about yourself. But that conversation in different forms went on for like probably close to 2 years, with him saying, Sue, write about yourself, and me saying no. And then actually what happened is that my parents died. And it just so happens that they died like 6 days apart from each other, completely unrelated. It just happened that way. And then my therapist said, well, Sue, maybe now you'll feel safe enough to write about yourself. So just to humor him, I said, okay, I'll write like a little paragraph. Well, 3 months later, I had this whole book.
And so it really came fast. It sounds like it poured out of you.
It did. But before anybody panics and thinks that, oh my goodness, I could not write something in 3 months, let me remind you, though, that I had spent 10 years writing fiction. So I was learning the craft of writing, even though initially it wasn't creative nonfiction. So I had already spent like a good 10 years just writing. So I do feel like I paid my dues as a writer, and that this book really was sort of a gift, in that I did write it pretty much version that's published in 3 months. But I also want to hasten to add that it took me like 5 years to write Lovesick. So that first book was sort of like, yay, 3 months, that's great. Even though, as I say, I'd spent 10 years writing, but everything else has taken me much longer to write. So don't feel bad if it's taking you a long time to write something.
Yeah, I don't think anybody should expect to get any writing project done in a few months, but it just goes to show that there's times when something's right on the surface, it just wants to come out.
It was ready to go.
Yeah. And then other times it takes years to get the piece of work completed. So clearly your therapist played a key role. What changed your writing life other than your therapist? After you wrote that first memoir, is there any other landmark events that happened in your life that you would say, or insights or pieces of advice people gave you that changed your writing life in some significant way?
Really, the only thing that I could say to that is that after I'd written that first book, and, nothing terrible happened to me. My father didn't, come out of, wherever people go when they die and hurt me. So writing that first memoir gave me courage to know that I could write about myself, and positive things could happen. I could get a lot of positive response from people who did not have a voice. And then the realization that, oh, I've written this memoir, but there's much more to me than just being an incest survivor. I have these other stories to tell. So it was this realization that a memoir is just one slice of a life, and that we all are very complicated human beings with lots of different narratives. And so it was just that realization that I guess I really came upon it myself, but after my first book was published, that, okay, there are more narratives here. And then too, this absolute sheer terror that if I wasn't writing, what was I going to do all day? Because there are a lot of hours in the day. And I knew I was a writer. I knew I could not write fiction. So I've got to do something. So I just said, okay, Sue, start another memoir. And the obvious thing then was to write about the 28 days I'd spent in rehab, as you know, for sex addiction. But I have to write to live. I mean, I teach now too, so I love working with my students. But otherwise, it's like, oh my goodness, what do I do for all of these hours?
Right. So you had in your father, you were an incest victim because of your father. And that was that what created the sex addiction? Because it seems that sometimes people go the other way, that they can't stand to be touched for that reason. And was the sex addiction a misguided attempt or belief that that's where love is found, that you're going to receive the kind of love that you're looking for through sexual activity?
Yes, and both those things are true in that. So when I was in rehab, I met a lot of women who had been sexually molested who never had sex. It's like you sort of go in one direction or the other. And for me, my direction was to that I only saw my self-worth through sex, or like if a man desired me, then I felt that I was worthy, that I was loved. And it was a misguided search for love because it really didn't have anything to do with sex. I didn't even really care about the sex that much. I just really wanted a man to want me. And if a man wanted me, then that was my high. That was the addiction. I felt great, just as any addict will tell you when they feel high, that's how I felt. But then when the man, because of course, all these men I quote, fell in love with, I wasn't really in love with them, but who I pursued, obviously they were all emotionally unavailable, because that's what, sex addicts do. We don't look for normal, healthy guys. We look for these dangerous men, so who are emotionally unavailable. So whenever they left me, then I would crash. I would go into withdrawal, just like any addict would. And then I would be in withdrawal, and I would only get high again when I found the next man. So it was up and down, like, just that addictive cycle for sure.
So you went through rehab for just 28 days, and you got enough out of that. I'm not saying that it was all over in 28 days, but I'm saying that you went through some intensive, probably confrontational type therapy that you brought out of there, and that really changed your life.
Yes, I was already in individual therapy and group therapy for sex addiction before I went into the 28 days, but I was really having trouble staying sober, which is to say I would still act out periodically. Sure. So my therapist said, Sue, you really need to go, we have to just put you away for 28 days so that we can so you can get more stable. And so I did. And so when I got out of 28 days, I won't say I never relapsed again, because I did, but
you caught yourself.
I did. I knew at that point, okay, I had a relapse, but the thrill is gone, as the song says, and it meant really nothing to me. And I knew that I was just harming myself, so I could stop it really quickly.
Now, you teach writing at Vermont College for Fine Arts, as you mentioned at the top of the program. Put yourself in the classroom. You've got a bunch of bright-eyed students who are there to learn about memoir writing. Talk about your teaching methods. What are the chief messages you're imparting? What are maybe some of the assignments that you give the students? Give us some insight into what it's like to be in one of your classrooms?
Okay. That's a really good question that I, of course, could speak to for hours, but I know we have a time frame here. But probably seriously, the first thing that I focus on is that in creative nonfiction, we both show and tell. A lot of fiction writers are told to show, don't tell. In creative nonfiction, we show and tell, which is to say that you want to write sort of that surface story of your experience, but then you also have the opportunity to dig deep and tell what it means. But one way to do that is not just like this sort of voice of like that sounds like commentary, but it's also to learn the metaphors of the experience. And the way to do that is to really focus on sensory details. You cannot work with me for 10 minutes without hearing me say, okay, you need to focus on sensory details. Like something's happened to you, you're in a room, something is happening to you. What are the details in that room? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? What does it sound like? Write those sensory details, but don't write them as a list. You have to slant them in such a way, as Emily Dickinson said, tell it slant. You have to slant them in such a way so that those those external details become metaphors that convey the interior self. So that's the most important thing, is to focus on the senses. By focusing on the senses, we create this world where you as narrator live. So focus on that, but don't just list the sensory details. As I say, write them in such a way, slant them. So for example, like, let's say you were, okay, this is maybe a weird example, but let's say you were at a McDonald's and something terrible had just happened to you. And so how would you see a McDonald's? They have the golden arches. I don't know, do they still have the golden arches they used to? How would you how do you describe those golden arches in such a way that they would convey you in a really depressed mood? Like maybe the yellow is sort of sickly looking and it's too bright or it's too harsh. Contrast that on a day when something great happened to you. Your book just got published and you're at a McDonald's, and those golden arches really are golden and they're glowing and they look gorgeous. So it's like taking those sensory details, and whatever your state of mind is, whatever your emotions are, you slant those details so that they will convey that state of mind. And that is the thing that is most important to do, I think, in creative nonfiction, yet ironically is very hard to do.
It is. There's so much nuance involved in that. And I think that a typical writer is going to be ham-fisted with that sort of thing. And until they have experience, it really takes a lot of experience. And also, I think you'd agree, reading really good writing.
Oh, yeah.
When you see other people do it, you pick up on that. It's no different than really anything else in life. When you watch well-dressed people, you pick up on all kinds of tips and you become a better dresser because you've been an observer. You've been an accurate and an observer with an intent. And
exactly.
That's how we read, don't we, Sue? I mean,
yes.
I tell people, people who are not writers, I tell them I don't read probably the same way you do. I read for wordplay. I read for vignettes. I read for character. The story is almost incidental to me when I'm reading a novel.
Exactly.
There's some much more important things at stake for me, and there's an intent there. You know all about that. You immediately lit up to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know. I'm just like vibrating here. Yes, yes, yes. And what you might do is that take like your favorite memoir, start looking at memoir, and start underlining places where the author is writing sensory details, and that these details are conveying an emotion, and underline them and really study how the author is doing that, because that will really help you a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what I'm looking for when I'm writing, and the sensory stuff, but other stuff as well. And it kind of jumps off the page when you see it.
Yeah.
I've heard you say you think it's especially important for women to tell their stories. Now, I think about men, and I think women tend to be very vocal. They tend to emote. Men tend to be have difficulty admitting to weakness or talking about bad experiences. Women seem to be much more at ease with that sort of thing. So explain why you think it's especially important for women to tell their stories.
Well, historically, though, men are the ones who got published. I mean, it's been, even now, more men get published than women. And it's not just women, it's really people who have not had a voice, BIPOC community, LGBTQ plus community. I mean, it's people who have historically not had voices. Our stories have not been published, and we have been silenced, basically. And I would say that that's one reason why that whole hashtag Me Too phenomenon happened, is because women have been silenced. If we hadn't been silenced, that whole movement wouldn't have started. Mm-hmm. And I think to a large extent, memoir, sort of the contemporary memoir, really sort of hit its stride about the mid to late 1990s. And I think that's when finally women's voices began to sort of creep into our bookstores and our consciousness. And I think that big outpouring of women's memoirs actually helped that whole hashtag Me Too thing, that women just really started feeling more courageous because we realized we weren't alone and that we could gather together and be heard. Now, look, men's stories are very important too, so don't get me wrong. And I agree with you that for some men, it is harder. I have a student, for example, who has written about his childhood sexual abuse. And I think it was harder for him to write about his than it was for me to write about mine, ultimately, because men are used to, just not talking about things like that, maybe even more than women. So men's stories are important. All of our stories are important, except for maybe the stories of celebrities. I think maybe we have too many celebrity stories, but I think that all of our voices really are important. And I really just sort of pointed out women just from a more traditional historical standpoint.
Sure. No, I get you. So I think that today there's never been a better time for a woman to be trying to get something published. There seems to be a really concerted effort on the part of the publishing industry to get people of color, people of different sexual orientations,
yes,
female writers, make them more prominent than they've been in the past. I think right now, what you're talking about, there's never been a better opportunity for women.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that once that we have more of a balance there of women's stories, then, because all of our stories are important, it's just that women sort of have to, and people whose voices have historically not been heard, that we sort of need to catch up and sort of be part of the conversation. And then at some point, it would be lovely to think that it won't really matter, whether you're BIPOC or white or, sort of what your sexual orientation is. Just that the human condition is important. And to turn our stories into art, because when you think about it, what really over the, hundreds of thousands of years and stuff, I mean, what actually lasts? Art lasts, culture lasts, leaders come and go, wars come and go. But the thing that really lasts is art. We're still looking at classical Greek sculpture, right? And that's art. Our lives, our stories, those are the things that matter, when you look at it from this really deep historical perspective.
Well, and I had a professor of Russian literature on the program a few months back, and I asked him, why have the Russian novelists and novels stood the test of time? It was so much more force, it seems, than so many others. And he says, because they wrote about the big questions of life. They wrote about
Yes,
love. They wrote about war. They wrote about greed and tragedy and so on. And really what you're talking about when people write memoirs, they're talking about the human condition. They're talking
that's
about what's
right.
gone on in their lives. That's something that's not going to change in 200 or 500 years or 1,000 years. That's
Exactly.
how we're constituted.
That's right.
We're going to be dealing with these same issues of love and neglect and the need for status, the need for freedom, and so on.
Yes,
So,
exactly. And I love the Russian novelists, by the way. They are. I mean, they're just brilliant. Yes.
right, right. Now you're an advocate of the smaller publishing houses. You think that they play an important role out there. Talk about the smaller publishing houses. Why you feel what role do they play that you think is indispensable?
Yes. First of all, let me say Lovesick was published with a big house in New York with Norton, and I had a great experience with them. And I'm lucky. I've had a great experience with all my publishers, but the small presses and the university presses really are important because they are more willing to take a risk on an untried author and a story that may not be completely mainstream. I think the big New York publishers they're sort of wary about taking risks and losing money. I mean, they're for profits. You know, the big New York publishers, they need to look at their bottom line. University presses are nonprofits, so they don't have to look at their bottom line. So they are more willing to publish voices that have gone unheard. And so I think that that's the biggest role that they play, that when they decide to publish a book or not, it's based on the merits of the book. It's not published on, it's not decided like, oh, how much money will we make or will we lose money on this book? Maybe they think about that, but it doesn't really seem like they think about it that much. It's much more, is this book good? Is it a worthy book? Is it a literary book? Does it add something to literature?
Exactly.
So we really need these small presses and university presses because they can really pick up the slack where the big New York publishers can't. Which isn't to say that, I mean, obviously the big New York publishers publish wonderful books. It's not that they don't, but it is harder to break in. And after Lovesick was published with Norton, I did go to a university press because I felt that, so my third book was the Pat Boone Fan Club, My Life as a White Anglo-Saxon Jew. I thought it was a quieter book and it wouldn't really be able to hold its own in the big New York mainstream publishing, like Lovesick, that's about sex addiction, that's going to attract people, maybe for the wrong reasons, but nevertheless, it's going to, attract people. And then it was made into a Lifetime movie, so it got, a good run. But I felt that the two books that came after that were just about quieter subjects. They were maybe more introspective, and that they would not do as well or sort of find their way as well in a big New York publishing scene. So I went with the University of Nebraska Press, who I absolutely love, and they published my two most recent books, and they've just done a phenomenal job with them.
Talk about your search for spirituality.
Well, it's been very misguided.
In what way?
In that, so with the Pat Boone book, I mean, because it really, I was so lost that I was what the book is sort of about is that I was looking for spirituality, not in a really deep religious sense or even a really deep spiritual sense, but I was looking for it like in sort of icon, sort of like Pat Boone, or one of the essays in there is called The Wandering Jew. And it's really about an obsession I had with this sort of homeless man. Well, I grew up in the West Indies. There was this homeless man who I used to follow around, and he was a tramp basically. And at the same time that I was sort of obsessed with him, I saw a Charlie Chaplin movie who, as you know, his famous role is that of a tramp. So I sort of put these two tramps together. So I was sort of looking for spirituality in these two sort of tramp figures. I mean, so it's not like going off and meditating. It's not like joining organized religion. It's not about going on some kind of a quest or something. It's really a very quirky search for spirituality. But where ultimately I end up is that in the book is that I have to find spirituality within myself. So in that sense, it's not misguided. I guess I'll just say it took me a long time to sort of get there, that I kept looking for it outside of myself but by doing that, ultimately I came to the conclusion that, oh, I really have to find it within myself. And more than that is that I did find spirituality through writing. And so, like, if I have a higher power, it's words, it's language. And so, yes, initially it was rather misguided, but I think I sort of turned the corner and I came home to myself and to my language and to my own words.
Now, what about fear of death? You've mentioned fear of death. You've even said that you flirted with death. What did you mean when you said that you flirted with death?
I mean it more from an emotional standpoint, in that so when I was acting out my sex addiction and I was involved with these men who were very emotionally dangerous. I mean, they saw me as a sex object. Granted, that's how I wanted to be seen, or the addict part of me wanted to be seen, but it was very emotionally dangerous. And in many ways, this addiction spiritually was killing me and maybe almost did kill me. So an addiction is slow suicide, whether it's going to be a physical death through overdosing on drugs or an emotional, spiritual death through using food or sex, something like that, that's going to emotionally kill you. But it is a slow suicide. I mean, that's what addiction is. And so in that way, and I also did have an eating disorder. I was somewhat anorexic, not too bad, but a little bit. And so I think all addicts really flirt with death because, as I say, whether it's physical or emotional or spiritual, it still is a form of death.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talk about yourself as being a quote unquote hippie chick back in the day. Talk about that a little bit.
Oh, all my love beads and flowers in my hair. And there was this sort of mid 60s, early 70s. There's sort of a freedom and a sense that we, sort of the flower children of that day, that we could accomplish or be or do anything. And there was such a strong belief in that. And it was just this movement where you were part of something bigger than yourself. I mean, this whole, stop the war in Vietnam and civil rights. And it felt very purposeful that we could stop the war in Vietnam. We could do something about civil rights. And so for me, being a hippie was being sort of part of that whole movement of resistance and standing up to the status quo and fighting against, misguided leaders like President Johnson or President Nixon. And there was so much like energy in the air. And it came off in our, weird hippie clothes and flower children and love beads and stuff like that. But it was a very invigorating time, which now I just don't see now. So I love that. And the music was great, of course. I mean, I love the music from the 60s and 70s. And I don't see that kind of energy now. And why aren't we all taking to the streets? Like for me, okay, so I'm a liberal Democrat. When Trump was president, why weren't we taking to the streets? Why? I mean, yes, there were demonstrations, but man, with him as president, there should have been demonstrations every day. I mean, there should have been a much bigger movement, which I don't really see. And so, yeah, I really sort of loved that time.
There were a lot of anthems that came out of that time period,
Yeah.
like For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield and Crystal Blue
Right.
Persuasion. And
Oh, right. And
yeah, a lot of songs that really marked the era and really
yeah,
speak to what was going on then with all the people in the streets, the
that's right.
protesting the Vietnam War and really calling into question a lot of the strictures of society
I know.
that didn't make sense to people anymore.
That's right.
So yeah, I get it. What are you working on now, Sue?
Well, funny you should ask, because just yesterday was my big deadline to turn in my revisions for my newest book, which is also going to be coming out with the University of Nebraska Press. So I've been working. Oh, I just been revising just like, nonstop 24/7 for the last like 4 months or so. And it's going to be another kind of instructional craft book. The title of it is Acetylene Torch Songs, Writing True Stories to Ignite the Soul. So it is about the importance of telling our stories. It's kind of a hybrid book in that there's some craft, but there's also why our stories are important. But there are also personal essays in it that I wrote especially for the book, that are examples for any craft issue that I'm talking about, to sort of show you how I did it. So it's kind of a hybrid book, but more instructional than a straight creative. So I just turned today, November 1st was my deadline. I wanted to get it in one day early. So I just sent it off like at 5:30 yesterday afternoon. So that was a big moment.
Well,
So
congratulations on that.
thank you. Thank
Getting
you.
that off your desk.
Yes.
How do you write? Are you a hand writer? Do you write at a keyboard? Do you do morning writing? Talk a little bit about your process. What really works for you?
Sure. Well, morning is best before I start getting into, emails and, and I don't let myself go on social media till after I've written. So mornings are best, but my first draft is always on a computer. And so I'll write it all, I'll type it all out on a computer. But then what I do is I print it out. And then on the printed pages, I take a pencil and I revise every sentence. And then I take all of those handwritten notes and revisions and put them back into my computer, make a few more revisions on the computer, then print it out again. So it's back and forth between computer and pencil.
Interesting. And so you're a morning writer, and
Yes.
are you of the mind that you need to write pretty much every day to find that groove or to find the momentum that's required to get a project done? Or are you more of the mind that when you're moved, you hit it?
It's ideally one would like to have time to write every day. But in the real world, that really isn't possible. Like when my students' work comes in, obviously, that I have to give them my priority. I want to give them my priority. So when their work comes in, I don't write at all. Actually, I get through their work and then I go back. And so I've learned how to sort of, toggle back and forth between the two. Sure, it'd be great to write every day, but nobody really can support themselves by writing unless you're Stephen King or something like that. And by the way, I'm not Stephen King, in case we needed to clarify that. So I cannot earn enough money on my writing to support myself. I do teach as well. And so, but I love to teach. So that is not a hardship whatsoever. But everybody's got to do something also, just, to pay the bills and stuff. So if you can't write every day, just don't panic. You'll write when you have to, and you will pick it up where you left off. You won't lose it. It's not going anywhere. Basically, you have to be, I think the most important quality for a writer is to be tenacious. Just do not give up. Just don't give up. The people who are not successful or who don't either get published or really even finish something, it's just because they gave up. They did not believe in themselves, or they didn't believe in something. I don't know. I happen to be one of the world's most stubborn people. I never give up on anything that I want, which can annoy some of my friends sometimes, but I just am really tenacious. And that's what it takes. So if you're tenacious and you have to write, and I have to write, I can't live without writing, then you will find time to write.
Mm-hmm. So writing's like breathing to you these days. It's your spirituality, and it's like taking breaths.
It is. It absolutely is. Yes. Yeah. It keeps me alive.
So when you're in the classroom, let's go back to the classroom for a minute. Are the people who sign up for your class, are they already committed to the idea that they want to write a memoir and they believe there's something in them? Or do you need to work with them to make them understand that there are stories there that they are overlooking or don't really see as stories?
So Vermont College of Fine Arts is an MFA program, so it's graduate school. So by then, most, if not all of my students, they're pretty committed to writing, which isn't to say they don't need encouragement, because as artists, we all need encouragement. I need encouragement. It's a lonely, hard business. So sure, they might need encouragement, and for them to know that somebody believes in them as a writer is helpful. But they're pretty committed once they do come to Vermont College of Fine Arts. Yeah.
Our guest has been Sue William Silverman. You can learn much more about her on her website. And all you have to do is Google that, but the URL is in the episode notes below. Sue, this has been really interesting. I appreciate you taking the time to let us into your world and share with us your experiences and all that you do.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, you're a great interview. I really enjoyed talking to you. Just thank you so much for your interest in my work and for having me. It's really been my pleasure. Thank you.